you have any experience on um, uh, artificially enhancing stubble breakdown, like for instance a kickstart in the bio activity in the soil on top and the bottom of the soil?
Yes, the main thing we've been doing is understanding the requirement for nutrients to break down stubble. So, and this was part of an experiment where I've been running a long-term no-till experiment comparing burning stubble, incorporating stubble, retaining stubble. It's in its 26th year now, and we were looking at the levels of soil carbon, and they weren't increasing very much, even though we were retaining all the stubble. And that was a puzzle to us because, we're burning it here, we were retaining it there, we weren't building up soil carbon. And we had a PhD student look at this, and basically the problem is you won't find carbon in soil, you find organic matter in soil, and organic matter has got carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus and sulphur, and they're in pretty predictable quantities. And so what was lacking in our system was some of the nutrients. And when in this experiment, we started just sprinkling some nitrogen, phosphorus and sulphur fertilizer onto the residue when we were incorporating it, we could very quickly break down, the residue broke down much more quickly, and we converted much more of that into soil carbon. So for us, I think we demonstrated that mostly the problem was a lack of other nutrients that are required to stabilise that carbon. There's been various other products, different biological products and all sorts of things that have been promoted and used, but I think that experiment demonstrated to us that the organisms that are required are already in the soil. What they need is the right kind of balanced nutrition to make them grow their population, turn over and die, and those dead microorganisms, they become the soil organic matter that's going to provide nutrition. And that experiment was quite clear. So I'd say the thing if you've got so the trouble with wheat residue, sort of wheat straw and cereal straw, they're generally very high in carbon but very low in nitrogen, phosphorus and sulphur. Whereas something like a green manure or a lucerne pellet or compost or chicken manure, I mean, they are very high in the nitrogen, phosphorus and sulphur as well as the carbon. So if you put them into your soil, they generally increase the organic matter and very quickly. So there are various other products promoted, but I think that experiment demonstrated to us it's more about the nutrition. And as agronomists, we've been very careful to just apply enough nutrients to the crop that the crop takes all the nutrient. In fact, we rely on the soil to give us 50, 100 kilos of N every year from mineralisation, and if that's not replaced, basically the soil organic matter slowly runs down. And we've lost our pasture phase in a lot of our continuous cropping country, so we can barely maintain soil carbon with full stubble retention and no-till. We can just barely maintain it, it's generally slowly dropping. So.
Hi, I have more of a genetic type of question. Is the canola genome fairly well characterized in terms of genetic maps and molecular markers you can use to track traits in, say, a breeding program?
I'm probably not the right person to answer the question. That's why I got out of research. Yes, we do use it, and it's going to be a very powerful tool.
Actually, I can add on that. That is one thing Bayer has done, is map the whole genome for canola. Do I understand it? No, but we have done it.
Yeah, I think the in Australia at least they're using the genetic map for blackleg. They're trying to track blackleg genes. What other things are they tracking? I'm not sure them, but certainly a lot of the early molecular biology was done on Arabidopsis, which is actually related to canola, related to brassicas, and I think the promise was that we'd learn what happens in that little plant. We'd be able to translate it all into brassica, and it turns out to be a lot more complicated than that because of the genome. But that's coming for sure. That's coming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Rick, what percentage of the canola planted in Australia is Roundup Ready canola, and for how many years have they been planting it? And the third question is there any problems with Roundup Ready resistance in that parts?
Well, I can answer the first one, that one thing Roundup Ready does do is an excellent screening tool for seeing if you do have some resistant ryegrass. But that's not a bad thing. So guys that have been able to see that and then make some different management decisions around how they handle it. Sometimes we're seeing ryegrass resistant to Roundup build up higher in number outside of the Roundup Ready system because it's kind of sneaking along without being noticed. So yes, it's identifying some issues, but it's changing the management strategy. So that's, I guess, that part of it. Most guys, that's why we're using trifluralin, propizamide, using pre-emergence is to help take some of that pressure off. They're also using gramoxones and spray seeds pre-spray rather than more Roundup. So I guess it's diversity is helping, and they're making sure the following crops are doing different things. So that's the resistance one. The percentages, I think, Rob's probably going to be able to answer a little more clearly than I, but I think last year it was 40% Roundup Ready in Western Australia, and we were the highest as a percentage state. So, Rob, do you know from a national what's the numbers?
It's around 25%. Western Australia is above 50%, and it's been falling in New South Wales and Victoria. Why it's rising in Western Australia is the grain handlers over there are not putting any restrictions on where it can be delivered to, or less restrictions. One of the issues we have in the east and also in Victoria and in New South Wales is that some of the grain handlers are choosing to limit where that can be delivered to, and therefore some growers are saying, well, it's too costly to take it 100 kilometres to delivery point. But as we go forward, we expect that this is going to change. The grain handlers and discussions with them, they are looking to come back on board with that, because if we don't have delivery points, it's not an easy way to get rid of it.
I guess the other point that I did miss, why the adoption is in Western Australia anyway, we have widespread Group A resistant ryegrass. So we can't kill it with clethodim or whatever anymore. So we need to have a rotational crop that's reducing the grass load before we go into wheat to see those benefits that John was speaking about before. So in the Geraldton port zone in particular, it was more like 70% because we also have resistant Raphanus, wild radish. So they were using it as another management tool to take pressure off. So.
Yeah, and I think that with the resistance in crop weed pressure, especially with hybrids, we know that we're getting some benefits, even though we get some resistance. You get a lot more help if you've got in-crop rather than trying to do it all outside of the crop.
Well, that was, John, your work was with the Stingray, the TT variety, which if anyone that's been to Australia and seen Stingray, I don't know, we call it the wild catch'em of wheat, which was a poor competitor, and Stingray is quite the same, so it's very susceptible to weed competition.
Rick, you were referring to the producer that you see as a top producer. I noticed on the slide you showed us that these moisture content was 4.4%. That's quite low. Is that a fact, or because what I'd like to ask you is we're talking about a quarter of a ton to increase our yields by that, and what we agreed upon is that many times we lose that quarter of a ton within the harvesting process. So what you find in our region is that the swartland, we don't swat. So the Southern Cape guys, due to the implants they do have, they swat and then they pick that up. But in the swartland, we straight it. We straight our canola. And I'd just like to have just a more insight from your point of view in the harvesting process, where you think we're losing it, because what we're saying to each other is that rather harvest it a bit more moist, let's say at 11, 12%, and dry it down, instead of trying to get it down to 6% and then you're losing it. So that's basically my question. Thanks.
Yeah, you've nailed me with a good one there. So if you look back at 2015, though, for us, we didn't have a spring. So the moisture content would be lower than, say, in a normal spring anyway, by default. So that's why his was quite low. But he swaths through there, mainly because they also grow malt barley. So they've got a, if you've grown malt barley, you know that you've got a, you're trading off. So they'll swath the canola, get it to the ground. Sometimes then they'll come back and pick up the swath while they're getting the barley off. They'll use a contractor. So it's not ideal always, but there's a few things going on, I guess, at the moment where we're even questioning, and it came up yesterday about the colour change and the optimal timing, swathing, direct heading. I don't think we have an exact answer. I think it's something that we're going back and looking at because the varieties we're using are different now to how traditionally they were. So with these hybrid varieties and with some of the traits like pod guard, which is a Bayer trait, it's giving us the ability to wait longer before we're coming in, whereas before sometimes we're going too early, sometimes we're going too late depending on who you ask. So I know I haven't answered your question because I don't think we've got the answer to the question. That's I'll handball, as we would call it, to Rob on this one.
Look, it is a really interesting topic, and one of the things that it's quite amazing if we start early in the morning, even in a windrow situation, we could be moisture up at 8-9%, and by the middle of the day we're back down to 4%. So we get a huge difference. And remember, I'm not sure about here, but in Western Australia particularly, and also in Western New South Wales, we're starting to get some really hot days when we're harvesting. So it could be 35 to 38 degrees during the middle of the day. So the moisture is coming out pretty quick.
You've had some comments on this topic on swatting and straight harvesting.
Yeah, so it's an active research issue at the moment in New South Wales. Because we traditionally windrowed, and I think the common rule of thumb was once you've got 30% colour change, so you would go into the main stem, middle of the main stem, take off a selection of pods and look at that, and if you had 30% roughly of seeds starting to change colour, that was a time to windrow. And then some commercial guys who, because of the cost of windrowing or swathing, started to just see what could they get away with, could they go later and later, and they started to do that, and with apparently some quite good results. They weren't seeing too much loss, except of course you're taking the risk that if you leave that crop till it's very ripe, and Rob said those days of 35 can just ripen the crop very quickly. If they come with wind and you start getting shattering, you can easily lose a lot of yield on the ground. So. We certainly currently would say that anything before 30% colour change you will be going too early, and then how late you're prepared to go if you're doing direct heading is a little bit to do with risk. The pod shattering varieties are certainly helping those guys who know because of their program that they may not get to a paddock and want to harvest late, direct head late. That's another tool that's helping.
Just a general question. What is the level of farmer retained seed in the canola industry in Australia?
Bad question to ask. Too much, depending on where it is. Most of it because in the more marginal areas, and it's with TTs. But yeah, it's really hard to gauge exactly what it is, but sometimes, some years we're seeing and guessing it's going to be probably 30 to 40%, and then other times it could even be higher than that. So yeah, it's not a question we like to answer.
I think it's just a difficult one because this year I can't believe where all this farmer retained seed came out of the woodwork to suddenly put another 250,000 hectares of canola in the west. So I wouldn't have thought there was that much around, but
I agree.
There was.
I agree. New South Wales hectares have risen substantially in the last, from the first forecast we had in end of May to the one in July is there's about another 30,000 hectares come into New South Wales, so we presume it's farmer safe seed.
Rob, you mentioned it's mainly TTs that they're retaining, and I assume mainly open pollinated cultivars. Do you have guys also have farm retained hybrids, and what percentage?
There are some people that have retained hybrids. Most of that has been Clearfield in the past, but there's a few people doing it with Roundup, but it is a very small percentage. There's been some work done by CSIRO did some, and also there's been state bodies, Department of Agriculture have been doing some work on that, the hybrid versus the F2 as we call it. There's been anything between 12 and 40 something % reduction. But there has been a few people try it, but it's not something that's practiced widely.
I've seen some guys this year that tried to experiment a little bit with stretching because we already ran out of seed. We didn't have enough seed, so that's why we're surprised where all this additional hectares came from. But they tried to stretch out some retained stuff that they just hadn't sold yet, and you can clearly see why they don't want to retain it, because it's just genetics. It's a quarter is going to have lost its hybridity completely and get killed by the Roundup and all those things. So they've learnt that one pretty quickly. It's not wise.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask our colleagues here from this side, Rob, a quick comment on your visit here and talking to our guys. Unfortunately, I haven't had the opportunity, I know, to see all the canola fields, but we've had a lot of talks and you've met a lot of people. A quick comment for a wrap-up, please.
Thanks, Andreas. I certainly have enjoyed my visit to South Africa, particularly where I've been. It's a spectacular country. The canola crops that I have seen, I've been very impressed with. And my closing comment to South African farmers is don't be too despondent on yields that you're getting now, and I know you'll improve. But when you look at average yields, and Rick made a comment that we don't like averages because there's more marginal areas that pull the average down. But I've seen some crops, and I've been talking to growers that have had yields close to or over 3 tonnes. So I think that you guys are in the right area, and you're very similar to our average across Australia, and we're not far behind Canada. As Freddie's graph showed, that we're a long way behind Europe, but we're talking about totally different climatic conditions. So keep up the good work, and I look forward to coming back very, very soon.
Yeah, I'd like to thank people for listening. I've never grown a canola crop in South Africa, so I hope some of the things we we talked about are helpful. And my main, I guess, thrust would be to understand better for yourself and your own farm what your yield potential is from season to season, and use some of those rules of thumb to target that. If any of you are ever in Australia and are visiting, please look us up and come and visit, and we'd love to take you out and show you some of our crops and visit some of our farms.
From my side, also a wonderful learning experience, learned a lot. I think it's very nice for us as South Africans also to the link to Australia, the type of climate, and I think the approach to farming is much more aligned with what we have here and more comparable to our European and American counterparts, just because of the climate. So it's very nice, I think, cutting it down to the bone, being as efficient as possible, and driving those last few cents and those margins out of every hectare. That's really what it's all about. So thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been great to be here, and we'll be back.
Rick?
Yeah, look, it's actually been good to see some familiar faces again coming in here. So thanks for the hospitality, and thanks for listening and some great questions. I think if there's anything I hope you guys can take out, it's not that we're coming here as experts on anything. It's just to go back to your farming system and find those little increments, whatever they may be, and they're going to be different for everybody else. It could be seeding system, fungicide management, or whatever. And if we just twigged a little light bulb to have a think about, that's a good thing. So, yeah, best of luck for the rest of the season, and thanks for your hospitality.